Chapter 10: Life and Labor at the California Diggings. 1. Mining Techniques, from panning to the mechanical cradle. The labor of the California gold seeker was a grueling, back-breaking ritual of concentration. The art of using gravity to separate the heavy, divine metal from the lighter, mundane debris of the riverbed. In the earliest days of 1848, the primary tool was the gold pan, a simple, shallow vessel of tin or iron. The technique of panning required a delicate, rhythmic, circular motion. A miner would fill his pan with pay dirt, submerge it in the icy current, and swirl it with a practiced hand. The water would carry away the lighter silt and sand, while the gold, possessing a specific gravity 19 times that of water, would settle into the deep rim of the pan. It was a task of immense patience. A man could spend 10 hours a day hunched over the water, his spine screaming in protest, only to find a few colors or a single jagged nugget as his reward. As the easy surface gold began to vanish, the miners were forced to innovate, moving from individual effort to collective primitive engineering. The first major evolution was the cradle or rocker. This was a crude wooden box mounted on transverse rockers, resembling a child's crib. It featured a riddle or sieve at the top to catch large stones, and a series of riffles, wooden slats, at the bottom. While one miner shoveled dirt into the hopper, another would rock the device vigorously while pouring water over the contents. The cradle allowed a small team to process 10 times the amount of earth that a single pan could manage. It was the first machine of the gold fields, and its rhythmic creak, creak, creak became the heartbeat of the Sacramento Valley, signaling that the era of the lone adventurer was giving way to the era of organized labor. Beyond the cradle lay even more ambitious structures, the long tom and the sluice box. These were long wooden troughs, sometimes stretching hundreds of feet, that diverted entire sections of the river. Water was funneled through these flumes at high velocity, washing over a series of riffles where mercury was often placed to capture the fine gold dust through amalgamation. This transition marked a fundamental shift in the mining mindset. It was no longer just about luck, it was about hydraulics and chemistry. The landscape began to change as miners built massive dams and diverted ancient watercourses, scarring the earth in their relentless pursuit of the veins. The labor was no longer just a search, it was an industrial siege against the very foundations of the Sierra Nevada. 2. The social hierarchy and diversity of the fortune hunters. The California gold fields were a sprawling, chaotic crucible where the traditional social structures of the 19th century were melted down and recast in the image of the shovel. In the diggings, a man's pedigree, his accent, or the quality of his linen meant nothing. The only currency of respect was his ability to endure the back-breaking labor of the pit. This created a radical social leveling that was both terrifying and liberating. Here, a former professor from Heidelberg might find himself knee-deep in mud, sharing a long tom with a deserting sailor from Liverpool or a fugitive slave from the American South. The gold did not care who held the pan, and for a brief shining moment, the social hierarchy was determined not by birth, but by muscle and luck. By 1849, the Sacramento Valley had become the most cosmopolitan patch of earth on the planet. This was a global stampede. From the west came the Chinese, bringing with them sophisticated techniques of water management and a communal work ethic that both fascinated and unsettled the European miners. From the south came the Sonorans and Chileans, veteran miners whose expertise in dry washing and arrastradas was far superior to that of the amateur Americans. From the east, the 49ers arrived, a tidal wave of New England clerks, southern planters, and Midwestern farmers. The camps were a cacophony of languages: the guttural German of the 1848 revolutionaries, the melodic Spanish of the Californios, and the rapid-fire Cantonese of the gold mountain seekers. However, this diversity was a double-edged sword. As the easy gold began to disappear, the initial spirit of camaraderie was often replaced by a poisonous nativism. A hierarchy of desirability emerged, often enforced by the barrels of Colt revolvers.
American miners, feeling a proprietary right to the soil, began to levy foreign miners' taxes and use violence to drive the Chinese and Latin Americans from the most productive bars. This tension created a fractured society. While the camps were integrated by labor, they were often segregated by fear. The fortune hunter was a man without a country, driven by an individualistic greed that could produce both heroic cooperation and cold-blooded exclusion. The social history of the diggings remains a testament to the fact that while gold can bring the world together, the scarcity of it can just as easily tear that world apart.
3. The economics of the champ: provisions, wages, and gold dust. In the surreal ecosystem of the California gold fields, the traditional value of money underwent a violent and grotesque distortion. While a miner might extract $200 worth of gold in a single afternoon, a sum that would take a laborer in New York a year to earn, he found himself living in a state of gilded poverty. This was the gold rush paradox. Wealth was abundant, but the means of survival were agonizingly scarce. In the absence of infrastructure, the golden grain, gold dust, became the only circulating medium, weighed out on brass scales in every tent and tavern. However, the purchasing power of that dust was eroded by a hyperinflation that turned common goods into luxury treasures. The economics of the pan dictated that as the difficulty of mining increased, so did the cost of existence. A single egg transported hundreds of miles over treacherous mountain passes could cost $1 in gold, equivalent to a week's grocery bill in the East. A gallon of muddy ale or a tin of rancid sardines often commanded prices that would have staggered a European aristocrat. Merchants like Samuel Brannan became wealthier than the most successful miners, realizing that the true mother lode was not in the riverbed, but in the pockets of the hungry, mud-stained men who returned from it. In the camps, gold was treated with a strange nonchalance. It was easy come, easy go, leading to a culture of reckless spending where a man might blow his entire week's findings on a single night of cheap whiskey and gambling. This environment also gave rise to a unique labor market. Since any man could theoretically strike it rich on his own, wages had to be extraordinarily high to entice anyone to work for another. A cook or a teamster could demand and receive $20 to $30 a day. This created a high-velocity economy where gold dust flowed in a perpetual cycle from the river to the miner, from the miner to the merchant, and eventually through the great shipping houses back to the mints of Philadelphia and London. The California camps were a pure economic experiment. They showed that when money, gold, becomes too easy to obtain, it ceases to be a store of value and becomes merely a frantic, fleeting tool for immediate survival. 4. Health and survival: sickness and the primitive temeshal. The glittering lure of the Sierra Nevada masked a grim biological reality. The gold fields were a landscape of physical attrition. The fortune hunter was often a man of urban origins, utterly unprepared for the brutal physiological tax demanded by the wilderness. Day after day, miners stood hip-deep in the glacial runoff of the mountains, their lower limbs perpetually numbed by the ice water, while their backs were scorched by the relentless Sierran sun. This violent thermal contrast, combined with a diet consisting almost exclusively of salt pork, moldy hardtack, and caffeine, decimated the miners' immune systems. The result was a proliferation of scurvy, dysentery, and canal fever, typhoid, turning the vibrant camps into silent wards of the dying. Medical science in the diggings was as primitive as the mining tools. Professional doctors were rare, and those who did exist often abandoned their Hippocratic oaths to pick up the shovel. In their desperation, miners turned to folk remedies and the indigenous wisdom of the local tribes. One of the most fascinating cultural adoptions was the temeshal, a primitive sweat house or steam bath used by the native Californians. A temeshal was a low, mud-covered structure built over a pit of heated stones. The sick miner would crawl inside the suffocating heat, enduring an intense perspiration intended to purge the poisons of the camp, before plunging into the frigid river. While this provided temporary relief for rheumatism, for those suffering from the bloody flux, dysentery, such radical treatments were often fatal.
The psychological toll was equally devastating. The California gloom was a recognized condition, a mixture of profound homesickness and the crushing realization that the gold for the taking was a myth for the majority. Survival in the camps was not determined by the strength of one's greed, but the resilience of one's constitution. Many who found their pile of gold never lived to spend it, their remains buried in unmarked graves along the banks of the Yuba or the Feather River, marked only by a rotting wooden slab. In the ultimate tally of the gold rush, the most expensive commodity was not the flour or the whiskey, but the human life force expended to drag the metal from the earth.
5. Lawlessness versus order, the authority of the alcaldes. The California gold fields existed in a unique legal vacuum. Technically, the territory had been ceded by Mexico, but had not yet been formally organized into a state of the Union. There were no established courts, no police, and no prisons. This void was filled by a hybrid frontier justice that balanced on the edge of a knife. The central figure in this fragile order was the alcalde, a judicial office inherited from the Spanish colonial system. In the mining camps, an alcalde was often elected not for his knowledge of Blackstone's commentaries, but for his reputation for straight shooting and a perceived granite-like sense of fairness. He was a one-man tribunal, judge, jury, and sometimes executioner, whose word was the only barrier between communal labor and total anarchy. Justice in the diggings was characterized by its terrifying speed and its visceral public nature. Since there were no facilities to house criminals, punishment had to be immediate and portable. For the crime of claim jumping, the cardinal sin of the goldfields, an alcalde might order a public whipping or the cropping, the cutting off of the offender's ears. For theft, which was viewed as a direct assault on a miner's survival, the sentence was often banishment or the noose of the oak. These trials, held in the open air under the shadow of the Sierras, were communal rituals. Every miner in the camp was expected to witness the punishment, serving as a grim reminder that while the gold belonged to the individual, the peace belonged to the camp. However, beneath this surface of lynch law, a sophisticated grassroots democracy was emerging. The miners formed districts and drafted their own written constitutions. These miners' codes were so effective that they later became the foundation for federal mining laws in the United States. This era proved that gold, despite its tendency to incite greed, also compelled men to create order out of chaos. The authority of the alcalde eventually withered as the formal legal machinery of the state of California arrived. But for those first few years, the law of the hills was the only thing that kept the American River from running red, with more than just silt.